Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. As we start our second year of broadcasting with this show today, I can't help but being drawn to the memory of the celebration and commemoration all last month of our previous year's shows. That memory reinforces what most of us realize as we experience and live our lives. Life is ironic, fragile, and transitory. We're, after all, mortal beings, but we can try and fill our life with love, awe, wonder, and beauty. And it can be filled with a wonderful imagination, the possibilities of what can or might be. It's an imagination that's often rooted in how we perceive and struggle to preserve memory. It's been only about 10 days since the passing of a dear and wonderful friend of the world and of the Radical Imagination show, Tom Hayden. It occurred to me with irony and amazement that Tom was intimately involved in the life, works, and struggles of all the guests I had on last month. Our first guest was Dr. James Gilligan, the activist psychiatrist who developed a deep friendship with Tom and had worked with him over many years on many events, writing, and research projects. Tom had also appeared a couple of times on a radio show I hosted called The Rebbe, The Radical, and the Rev on Progressive Radio Network. That's a network started and developed by our second guest of the month, the alternative health activist Gary Null. Tom and I, by the way, as you might imagine, we're not the Rebbe or the Rev on the show. Our third guest was my co-host on this show, the sociologist Stanley Aronowitz, who goes back well over 50 years with Tom to the Port Huron statement writing days and countless other debates, events, and political struggles they were involved in. Our fourth guest of the month was the Marxist economist Rick Wolff, who also spent many years working with Tom on various projects and events. Rick recalled to me before last week's show that he was a guest speaker with Tom at an event in California in June. His last memory of him was his struggle with the illness that was taking its toll. My own last memory of Tom was about 2 weeks before his stroke, during a taping he did on Democracy Now! That I attended. He spoke of a Washington, D.C. event he was going to, commemorating the Port Huron Statement and the fight to retain its memory, and I accompanied him to Penn Station after the show. He was in great spirits, funny and gracious as usual, as we battled the crowd to get to his train. He was hopeful we could carry on our conversation and that he could charm the Penn Station security crew into letting me accompany him to the train, even though, of course, I was ticketless. Unfortunately, we lost that battle. In a less uptight world, I know we would have been able to finish that conversation by that train. Over the past year, I came close 3 times in getting Tom on this show. The last time was about a month ago, in an attempt to reunite Tom and Stanley Aronowitz on the show we did with Stanley. His always gracious assistant, Emma, said that when he was feeling better, he'll reach out and reschedule. Illness and last-minute engagements, unfortunately, won those battles too. But I've invited 3 terrific friends and comrades of Tom to be on the Radical Imagination today. I know he would have been happy to see all of us imagine and fight to retain the memory of SDS and its attempt to build a better world. Al Haber was in fact the first president, or field secretary, as he was sometimes called, of SDS, Students for Democratic Society, preceding Tom, who was the second. Bob Ross was one of the first organizers, as well as presently being a sociology professor at Clark University. And Sharon Jeffrey Lehrer, who will be joining us later in the show, was another of the early organizers of the movement, and a civil rights activist in her own right. So I'm thrilled you're all here. Thank you all for being here on The Radical Imagination.
Nice to be with you, Jim.
Great, great, Bob. Great, Al. Wonderful.
Yes, I'm here too.
Wonderful. We see you. Thank you, Al. And Bob. And Sharon will be joining us soon. So, listen, let's start with how you all got together. Where did you meet? This was in Ann Arbor in the early 60s, late 50s. How did this all happen? You were students there. Tell us these early days of your organizing and of your friendships and meetings. Let's start with you, Al. Or Bob. Either one. Doesn't make any difference. Whoever would like to pipe in here.
Well, let me just give a little line of thought.
Sure.
SDS came out of a prior organization that began back in 1905 or thereabouts with American radicals, Jack London, up to Sendero, people out. And in 1959, we determined to change our name to Students for Democratic Society. And at that point, proposed a conference on racism, discrimination in the North that Ann Arbor would host. This Student League for Industrial Democracy was fairly moribund under the impact of McCarthyism. I had begun when I became a student at the university in 1954. I was prevailed upon by some of the radicals of probably the previous SLID and who were not public in their politics anymore, to start a political issues club. And so as a freshman, and then I continued that, and every fall we would, and people would come and we'd say, we're going to talk about political issues and so on. And so that was in 55 was the first one of those, in 56 and 57 and 58. And it was not a very spirited affair. In 59, when that same meeting happened and we had just become the national organization of SDS, which I was sort of presumed the Political Issues Club would be part of, and we called the beginning memory, it was different from everyone before because there were people who were really active, hot, interested, full of energy, and Bob Ross was one of those. And that crew of the Political Issues Club, new SDS, from September 1959 began undertaking to make this conference and to become friends with one another. And that's where I met Bob, I met Sharon. When we actually had our conference in 1960, could well have been when I met Tom. But I was, my apartment was just behind the Michigan Daily building, and I would frequent late into the night the nickel coke machine there, and so I probably met Tom along the way. So that's my memory, that Bob came to some meeting and we cooked up some conference. It seemed to be right on time in April of 1960 after the sit-ins after the organization of SNCC. And people came to Ann Arbor from black and white, north and south, old and young, labor and church and students, and it was a good gathering. And some solidarity was formed there, and SDS got put on the map. And I'm sure Tom was, as a reporter of the Michigan Daily, part of that, where he was in the actual process. I don't remember. What do you remember, Bob?
Well, I have each person has his own and her own point of entry to a story such as Tom's. So my part of this story begins with the Southern sit-in movement, which of course begins on February 1st, 1960. And in Ann sprang up, organized by some graduate students and others, a sympathy boycotts of Woolworth and Kresge and picket lines. I was a first-year student then, and I joined the picketing of Woolworth and Kresge. And I learned about, at the tender age of 17, I got arrested. The merchants in the shopping area were upset at these political protesters. You must recall that this is February 1960. This was post-McCarthyism. Things had been quiet. So they were upset and prevailed upon the Ann Arbor Police Department to arrest those of us who were passing out leaflets, "Why We Picket." So my first arrest was for, believe it or not, littering. And a couple dozen of us, or maybe a dozen, were taken down to the Ann Arbor Police Station, where we waited for a very long time while the organizers sent to Detroit and got an ACLU lawyer out to Ann Arbor to work on our behalf. And in the meantime, in this crowded lobby of the police station, there was this young guy from the Michigan Daily, young then. In today's eyes, he was older than me. He was 3 years older than me, which meant he was an old guy. I was 17 years old. And that's when I met journalist Tom Hayden. A couple months after that, I found out about this conference that was being held on civil rights in the North was the topic of the conference. There was a registration fee of, I don't know, what was it, Al? $25. So I went to the organizer, Mr. Haber, and I said, I don't have the $25. Can I come anyhow? And he said yes. That's when I met Al and got involved with SDS. He recruited me to the brand new SDS. It had been something else earlier, and the Political Issues Club. And we went to New York for a so-called national conference. It was pretty small at that point to work on recreating this older organization. Well, in the meantime, back in Ann Arbor the next year, Tom was the editor of the Michigan Daily, and we became roughly acquainted, not very closely, where he did stalwart work on student civil rights, including racism on the part of one particular university administrator, and his exposés about this person who was harassing women who went out with black men. So we all knew about this work that Tom was doing, and it gave us a lot of respect for him. And I would imagine it was during that year that Al and Tom became more closely acquainted. Well, then, Tom went to Berkeley one summer and came back with the idea of a student political party. And he and a couple of his other editors formed Voice Political Party. Sharon, Jeffrey, now Lehrer, and I were young SDSers, and we joined. And it was our idea to make the SDS chapter, which had been the Political Issues Club, was to bring voice and make it the SDS chapter on the University of Michigan campus. And we were successful in doing that. After Tom graduated, Sharon and I became the leaders of that, and very much with Tom's encouragement. And Voice became the largest, most broadly based SDS chapter through the mid-'60s.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, Bob, can we understand that Sharon is now on the line. So this might be a great, oh, look at the smile. Oh, look, oh, all right. So here she is, and she's celebrating her birthday all this this week. And so, Sharon, welcome to the Radical Imagination. Bob and Al are here. So tell us as well how you got involved in this movement.
How did I get involved
Is Sharon
in this
going to be in
movement?
the picture?
I'm not, well, she's calling, so I'm not sure, but we can certainly hear her, and that's
Okay.
that's terrific. Sorry, Sharon, but tell us your involvement, how you got started.
I had just started the University of 1959, the fall, and there was a sign up that said, to support the students in the South, or I can't remember what it was, to organize something. And anything that says organize a move to my interest. So I went to this meeting, and there was this bearded-looking man sitting in the front. By what he had to say, he had real perception and real vision. And after the meeting, he introduced myself, Haber. The rest was history.
Okay.
At that moment.
So it was just Al getting up there, and that was it. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I have to say that Al and Bob are two people that, and for me, I just want to, for the record, say that it was perception.
Gosh, I wish I could hear that sentence.
You can't hear me?
Repeat that, Sharon.
I'm missing some
Bob and Al
keywords.
wanted to get
It's
that.
good.
What did you?
It was Alan who had the perception to see beyond political reality and to see a bigger picture, and not only to and that racial discrimination and the military and et cetera, are all interwoven at a systemic level. He also had the capacity to think brand new. And he had a concrete plan, which was to organize. And all those three souls in my spirit, as it did Bob, and the three of us became the nucleus that went out and one by other people. It was the three of us who would go one by one to the University of Michigan, the Michigan Daily, and introduce ourselves to Tom Hayden, who was writing these articles that we thought he could be a good recruit. And he did political background or history, but he had a big heart, and he and the Southern struggles. So eventually, through a lot of conversation with Al and Bob and me, and he began to see that there was more to it than just and those were the nascent moments of national student movement, which had never ever happened in this country before. So it was a brand new idea that popped into Alan's head and got the depth and the meaning and the significance of what Al was saying, and knew that we wanted to participate and create that. To me, was the very that was that was like the seed that gave birth. That's my story.
Terrific! Wow, that's incredible. So Al, Bob, you does that ring true to your own experience at that time? Your feelings? You were creating the seed of a much larger movement, seeing the interconnections.
Al, can I say something?
Absolutely. Say whatever you want. Go ahead. Sure.
Well, that phrase that you just used and that Sharon used reminds me of the morning at the AFL-CIO summer camp in Port Huron, Michigan, where we had been up all night revising and voting on the revisions of the draft of what came to be known as the Port Huron Statement that Tom had drafted, and we had participated in talking about and contributing to. And we were up all night, and I remember at dawn walking along the shores of what was that? Yeah, would be Lake Huron, exhausted as the sun came up and thinking, we are really doing something new. This is going to make history. I just had this inner sense, which of course was improbable. It was improbable that it was going to be true, because I've been in a lot of launches since then that haven't worked out.
But you had this radical imagination. Right?
Yes.
And
I just had this sense that we were on the brink of something big and new. So what Sharon says captures a lot of our, well, I think, Jim, you have it correctly, what we thought of as a radical imagination. I'm sorry, Al, you were going to say.
No, go ahead, Al. Yeah. So you're up all night with the draft, and Al, what was your feeling also at the end of this creative process? Did you feel you were onto something that was really going to transform history?
Yes, I was very excited. I was probably tired, but when I undertook the SDS, I think when I became clear this is what I was doing, was in the end of November in 1959. We had the name. I was part of student government, and I was studying, and I was going to parties, and I was doing this conference organizing, and I got very sick. And I was in the hospital, and they thought this was the end for him. My mother they didn't tell me how sick I was. So I had just finished the student government election. I had been elected in the previous year, and then I ran again, and I got a lot of votes. And the student government came to my bed to say, would you like to be student government president? There was a delegation.
Wow, yeah.
And on my bed of passage there, I said, no, I'm going to make the Students for Democratic Society, and we're going to change the world. That it was at that point, do I go into the student sandbox, or do I try and live this big vision that had developed in my academic educational career and in whatever the influences were? So I was for the big picture, bringing all the questions together, and I worked at it through that 1960 conference and continuing. I got employed by the LID, and then they fired me, and then they hired me. And we finally got this manifesto in process, and everybody put in their ideas and got together in a draft, and somehow we got a place to talk about it at Port Huron through Sharon's mother's intervention with the UAW. We got this great place and good food, and we were all there together, and it seemed like it was our replication of the beloved community. We were working with ideas and with a sense of a future history, and we were part of it, and I loved everybody. And so I was very up. I thought this was
life transforming.
We all love you.
We can feel the love all over. Go ahead, Sharon. Yes.
So here it was, this vibrant conversation, just humming in the big dining hall, and we were debating, and we were arguing, and we were refining our ideas, and our passion with love was strong. And then late into the morning, early mornings, as Bob said, we got up from the conference, we down the little hill onto the sandy beach of Lake Huron, and there we are all standing on the beach, and the sun is rising, this beautiful yellows and oranges and purple.
Mystical experience.
And we're all in awe of what we're doing and feeling the significance of it, knowing we are creating history, knowing we are a vision. We all knew this, and we just, and the symbolism of the rising sun
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank-
and confirming everything we were feeling.
For our audience, can you just give us a brief description of this broader vision so that we understand this incredible prophetic vision that you all had and were trying to put down in some sort of concrete form? What were the major ideas that you were grappling with and that you would like our audience to come to grips with too and understand what this document was about?
So who wants to go for that?
I know it's
How
a
about I
huge
give it a
question,
brief
but
try and turn it over to you, Al. So if you look back on that document now, among the striking things that begins is a statement of values. Behold, and it does say men, but I think it meant people, to be infinitely precious. And it goes on to describe a world that is deeply riven with inequalities of race, and it talks about that, about racism and discrimination and the Southern movement, and issues throughout the country in great detail. It talks about poverty. It talks about an arms race that threatens the annihilation of human civilization and the desperate inequalities of underdevelopment in the former colonial world. But it proposes that the solution is a rebirth of democracy, what we called participatory democracy. And the vision of democracy was far deeper, more profound and rich than merely walking into a voting booth. Mm-hmm. But it envisioned, as did one of our professors who was our teacher, Arnie Kaufman, thought that citizenship and democracy was something that was elevating for the citizen herself. And that deep, constant engagement, face-to-face with comrades, colleagues, and neighbors would sustain a different kind of country, and that we could solve these problems by becoming more democratic. That's the summary from my point of view.
okay, all right. Al, you want to add a couple of points?
Well, as we ended, we drew attention to self-empowerment. Students as an agent of social change, the institution we were in as a key institution in the transformation of society, which is, of course, the case in whatever institution you are and whatever hat you wear. You are an agent of change if you so choose. And every institution is part of the leverage because it's an integrated society. As I recall, the notions of ecology and integrated systems were just coming into the academic world. The 1950s in Ann Arbor and I guess all over the country was a ferment of reshuffling the basic ideas that were, history had ended back then again, and this was the time. What really are the dynamic forces? Because what was going on was not all right. And that was the fundamental. As Bob says, we began with values. Mm-hmm. Then it was values that what's going on is not all right. It is dangerous. What we said at the end, we seek the unattainable because we don't want the unimaginable and now here we're faced with the unimaginable because we didn't quite get the unattainable. We made a big jump at it. But I think there's a sense that this is an integrated life system and we are agents in it. And when the Intercollegiate Socialist Society began in 1905 as the forebearer of the League for Industrial Democracy and then the Student League for Industrial Democracy and then the Students for Democratic Society, the vision of higher education as articulated by the president of Harvard at that time was the passionless pursuit of passionless knowledge. Mm-hmm. And we were basically for turning that on its head. with passion in the society that things are not right, they need to be changed. We are part of making the change. There's no neutrality on the moving train and all that. So this document was connected with an organizational intention moving into history. And that was different from a academic reflection on the troubles of the world or a philosophical reflection on how things could better be. This was an action document. We first called it a manifesto, but one of the changes that we adopted at Port Huron was that, well, this is really a living document that has to be changed as the times change. So we called it a statement rather than a manifesto.
That's a great point. Yeah, living document.
A step down or a step forward, but anyhow, it was one of the bones in our debate. As we debated all the discussions that came up, we broke into workshops and different ones, to cut up the draft. But when we came back, we had a lot of proposals and we divided them into the big ones, which were the bones, and the little ones, which were the widgets. And we voted on bones and widgets, as I recall. Maybe I'm just making it up. But and then we gave the result of that to Tom and the Styles Committee, who was basically Tom to revise the draft.
Well, we were on that committee.
Yeah, I know. And I played an active role, I'm sure. But
And Sharon too? Sharon too? Were you on that committee?
I wasn't on the committee, but I felt very much a part of it.
Right. And you were involved in the civil rights movement at the time as well, right, Sharon?
Yes, I was. I went to a workshop with Martin Luther King in Florida on the beaches. We integrated the Black Beach, and we registered voters.
Mm-hmm. So that...
But my allegiance is, I have to say, that the
Please.
civil rights movement was the agent that really... ability to organize students and to show them that there was more just civil rights was, quote, a problem in our country. And that's what SDS offered to the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement.
I see.
That there's a whole system thinking that went on that we understood and about.
So listen, the conditions, the economic, the political, the moral, spiritual, intellectual ideas and perspectives you were grappling with, still we're struggling with some of the same issues, and some of those issues have in fact gotten worse since you all were organizing back in the 60s. So Al, in particular, you're working on what? A new Port Huron statement, or revamping or revising, or is this a venture that others can get involved in as you yourself were?
Well, thank you for making that inquiry.
Well, Tom made that inquiry too. I remember on the at NYU in that event there. So.
Well, as we approach the 50th anniversary of the Port Huron Statement, recognizing its strengths, also not only was the potential of organization different and wider and broader and deeper, but the questions we understood were also, wider and broader and deeper. And it seemed to me that then was then and now was now, and what's the manifesto for now? And could we use that methodology of Port Huron, inviting input from everybody who, cared, and then sorting it out somehow into the bones and widgets and putting together a collective document that could perhaps serve in our time for a wider organizational form and collective intentionality, or whatever such a document might be. And I pursued that with some consistency, occasional vigor. It did not quite take hold. I was hoping there might be something of that sort when the 50th anniversary conference came up, but again, it remains a need in my view, but not yet an operational program. I did have a reflection that maybe Tom's passing and the passing of somebody who is a link in a very wide world of conscious social change might draw us to look at the situation of now and formulate again a statement of values, analysis, program, and action commitments that could serve this time in a more unified way, because everybody is active. There's so much consciousness, you can hardly stand it, that people are in our own silos. And if we could take the imagery of the crystal and include all the facets of the political eye, that would be a bridge. If we could find some of the deeper spiritual understandings that we came to out of a politics that was in many ways quite materialistic in our analysis. You know, there's so much that has been learned, and what we attempted then has a much wider potentiality now. So, you know, I keep saying this sort of stuff, and mostly I'm working locally, and I can't read so fast just to be able to absorb all the things people say. And Tom was wonderful. Tom was able to take the words of many different people and put them into a language where they could both hear what they had said before and broadcast it, amplify it to many other ears. Whether we can find a way to do that again, who knows? But yes, I did have this notion of a manifesto for now. And if you wanted to have a program to invite, you know, threads of the radical imagination and see what we could weave out of them, you know, more power to you, and count me in.
I would absolutely love to do that. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm sure Bob would be part of it. I'm sure Sharon. We just had Stanley Aronowitz on a couple weeks ago. I'm sure he would join in. There's loads of people that would. So let's do that. Let's make that happen.
Well, let me suggest that you invite the young ones. It's really the young ones who,
absolutely,
you know, the millenniums and the Black Lives Matter and the whole young, whoever they all are, because they're the ones who are going to have the energy to organize it.
We've tried to do that, Sharon.
Their way of, I have to really listen to them deeply, because, you know, they're not where we were.
Way ahead.
And we are at a similar but different place. I think that times now are actually more serious than they were back then. I think serious is that the institutions, the entire structures in our country and around the world are falling. We saw the tower institutions are cracking, and something brand new is going to come forward. Whether now we can create manageable in a way that allows the new to give birth without crumbling so much and left to crack together. So it really requires extraordinary visionaries and people who can see really beyond our current reality, to draw forth beyond where we are, our beliefs, our structures, everything. It's just we're at a very profound moment. And I think that the call for democracy is being significantly challenged right now. And it brings back we're as deeply committed to that. And actually, as I listen to the two of you, at a spiritual level, the belief in the human, our capacity, if we're well cared for and nurtured, will be to really care for each other and create a world that works for everybody. And I think we're really being called upon, even more than back then, to raise to the higher are as humans and our inalienable right to love and be creative and all the things, our values, from being
absolutely
more.
Absolutely, Sharon. I could agree with you more. Go ahead, Bob.
Last spring, as the Democratic primary contest was still contentious. Tom wrote some terrific things that were the combination of journalism and advocacy. In one of his pieces, in his very wonderful newsletter, he said, this is the moment, this is the generation of Occupy and the Sanders youth. And he was pretty clear in his mind, and I think as a sociologist he's correct, that you had two kind of direct action oriented movements. You had Occupy and then Black Lives Matter. And they created a sense of motion, of action, even if I and many other people were filled with criticisms of Occupy, and I have, at least in the early days, I had some criticisms of Black Lives Matter, not so much recently, but at any rate, and the energy in the Sanders campaign as the logical result of those movements. And I think that that is accurate, and that there is a cohort, a very broad cohort of people from 20 to 30 or 15 to 30 who now have a good bit of experience and engagement and have a lot of ideas. And they're both visionary, as the semi-utopian Occupy people had, but they're also programmatic, as the Sanders people had. And this is the magic formula, as a matter of fact. It's the Port Huron formula. It's what Hayden was an expert at, was being at the edge of visionary and pragmatic, of seeing the next big thing that you could turn into something actionable. So in that regard, I'm actually fairly optimistic. And the fact that I hope we elect a centrist president instead of a semi-fascist, the fact that we will have a centrist president does not make the situation any worse than it was in 1961 when we had a centrist president, which turned out to be a time when we got a lot of organizing done. So in that regard, I'm pretty optimistic about the next couple of years for people who have this combination of ambition to make change and vision of how to do it, to get more nearly organized than they've been. Whether that's a manifesto, who knows? I don't think we can use templates from the past all the time, but I think there are an awful lot of activated human beings in our part of the planet who are going to do good things.
Yep. Try to make this show a forum for a lot of people with alternative narratives, and we certainly have made it available and open to many of the young people in Black Lives Matter movement and some of the other progressive student movements, particularly as it relates to mass incarceration, criminal justice issues as well. I want to ask you here.
I wanted to say something about this.
Please. Okay, go ahead.
From the old and the young.
Okay.
Both psychology and the old biblical wisdom says the sins of the fathers are onto the children to the third and fourth generation. And the situation we live on is the derivative of the sins of the fathers 3 and 4 generations ago. And what the kids are dealing with now is what has been created by our leavings and our parents' leavings and our grandparents' leavings that we've all tried to deal with. Until we see 3 and 4 generations together working on our common dilemma, no one really has an adequate perspective on what the hell is going on and how to find a way through the eye of the needle out of it. So I think this sense of there has to be a mutuality in the relationship across generations. The new SDS, when it formed, had, to my objection, but I could still understand, a bylaw that said nobody can be a member who's over 30 years old. And But they
Yeah.
did let me in an honorary mode into some of their meetings.
There you go.
And so this sense of intergenerationality and in my more later years, I became more connected with my Jewish roots. The last words of the last Jewish prophet are, unless there is a turn of hearts across the generations, from the fathers to the children and the children to the elders, there will come the great destruction. If we're blocked in the movement of energy across generations, it will lead to our demise. And so we really have to see this intergenerational question as most imperative. And it is a turning of hearts. It's not finding the right words, it's finding in some sense the human connection. And we're all abused in our intergenerational lives in one way or another. But that's part of the challenge, and it's internal work, it's family work, but it's also seen that it's a large cultural shift too.
Absolutely. It is part of our tradition here at the Radical Imagination. Speaking of your Jewish roots as well as mine, I've had people on like Rabbi Michael Lerner, Susanna Heschel, and we've explored the next couple weeks from now. We're going to have a representative from Jewish Voice for Peace. So that's a very important component of this transformation. Reverend Barber, I wanted to ask you, I know we're getting a little short on time here, but I wanted to ask you about your feelings concerning Reverend Barber and the Moral Mondays movement and the moral high ground movement he is leading, a vast ecumenical movement that I think those organizers from SDS could identify with. Are you familiar with his efforts, and what do you think about them, and how they can be brought into this larger spiritual transformation you're talking about? Cornel West has been on the show. We've had 2 or 3 shows on the idea of radical love. So I think all of you are talking about some of the things that are desperately needed in the world. Any of you are familiar with what Reverend Barber is doing?
Beautiful man,
Isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
He's incredible. What he's done in North Carolina and is persistent. He doesn't give up.
He's the real thing.
Jim,
And he's got a big challenge. There's a big challenge in North Carolina right now.
Absolutely.
He's a big man.
Right.
I am roughly familiar with Moral Mondays, but there's something about it that I don't know the facts about. Is those gatherings, and does his work, does it then convert into voter registration and get out the vote activities?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. He's having, actually, there's a conference, there's an event this Sunday at Riverside Church, New York City. I think it's at 6:30. That is about that, organizing people in voting and community efforts and so on. So he absolutely is attempting to bridge that gap of the lack of this sort of organizing that we seem to desperately need. To go back to some of the things you're talking about, family and community and restructuring of institutions at this spiritual level, the spiritual progressive level, that Tom, as you point out, was so much aware of. In the few minutes we have left, any comments, reminiscences about Tom? Anything you'd like to tell us about your? I know, Al, you said in an email to me that you had a wonderful relationship, but you also had a contentious relationship. And I'm sure perhaps Bob and Sharon also. But tell us a little something about your personal relationship with Tom.
Well,
Our personal what? Back then or now or what? What do you want?
Either way, whatever comes to mind, whatever you feel like telling us.
Well, I just have to tell Bob and just fine back then. It was so fun and so extraordinary. It was really extraordinary that is beyond what any one of us can think about in terms of even solutions. I think all the solutions, they're not from the beyond of imagination. As Einstein says, we've got to get outside of our box, and we are definitely in a big. I want us to step outside the box and look for creative solutions that none, because they're to imagine almost. How do we get into the realm of beyond imagination, where imagination imagines itself? We're creating the understanding of how reality works that has a more metaphysical or of the new sciences kind of perspective that we can tap and be creative together with. That's the seed I'd like to plant.
Go ahead, Al.
I think it has a lot to do with the imagery and the art we can create among ourselves as to how we see who we are and what we're doing and what's going on. And I want to repeat just a little story that in my woodworking, I've become a woodworker. I made a table for the meeting to make peace in the world. In the shop, we called it the butterfly table because it sort of looked like mating butterflies supporting up the circle of heaven above the square of earth. And it had the imagery of the receptive. It was very beautiful. And Sharon had seen it early in its life when it was first made in Berkeley, California in 1976, I think it was finished. It was a table for the meeting after the end of the Vietnam War. But if we're actually to change the world, we have to end the system of war. There has to be a meeting to end war and begin peace. No meeting without a table. What's the shape of the table? So I took that on. And I made the butterfly table. It since was called the Megiddo table because go to the place of the big war, Megiddo, Armageddon, to make the big peace. Well, when I saw Sharon at the Port Huron 50 years, and she came to Ann Arbor, the first thing she said, Al, I got to tell you a story. And so she said, do you know about the butterfly? And I said, because this was a butterfly table. And I said, so what, butterflies? So she said, well, here's the way it is, and this is science. That the caterpillar, when it gets to be mature, it just eats everything around it, and it just fills itself up with, it's just totally egoistic. It eats everything, it consumes, and then out of itself, it spins this cocoon around itself to protect itself, to engross itself. But some of itself, it breaks out of the walls of its own cells and becomes an ooze inside this cocoon. And the old caterpillar sees this ooze and sees it as different from itself, even though it is of itself. And so it sends out its immune defenses to protect itself from itself. And then itself out there in the ooze feels this attack on itself. And so it sends up its defenses to protect itself from itself. And what do the scientists, and so the ooze in defending itself reconstitutes itself as the butterfly. So this is the process by which the caterpillar is transformed into the butterfly. And Sharon says, so do you know what the scientists call these cells, this ooze inside the old mature breaking up the caterpillar? They call them the imaginal cells. And so if you wonder who you are, we out here in the ooze breaking out of the cells of the old caterpillar, we are in the ooze, and we are part of the butterfly reconstituting ourselves from the ooze.
Al, as part of the ooze here, we've got about a minute to go. Bob, I wish we had much more time, and we should do another show on this. Bob, any final thoughts by you?
Yes, I do. I want to respond at the end with a reflection on Tom's later years. You asked us in this round to think about Tom personally. His health began to get rocky 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when he had a heart attack. And since then, we found ourselves together in 2012 quite frequently, 3 or 4 times because of the 50th anniversary and conferences and panels and so on. And somehow that renewed a relationship that had become distant geographically and in activity. and we stayed in touch by email and so on. And I found him in this situation, which he was somewhat more frail, conscious of the end of life and extremely generous and gentle. He was a warm person.
Bob, I'm very unfortunate. I've got to cut you off. I just want to add, I found the same thing is true in my own experiences the last several years with him. And I've got to thank you all so very, very much for joining us all here on the Radical Imagination. Al, Sharon, Bob, bless you all, and thank you again so very, very much for being here.
Tom Hayden, presente.
Absolutely. Join us again next week.
Thank you what you said, Bob, about Tom. That was really good to hear and put out on the radio.
Absolutely.
Very,
and
very
and happy birthday, Sharon.
Happy birthday,
Happy
Sharon.
birthday. And thank you all for watching.
I am having a radical imaginal realm birthday.
There you go. Thank you all for watching. This is Jim Vrettos. I'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
Bye.
Okay, folks.
Bye-bye.